Honesty is the best policy, supposedly. But not everyone subscribes to that belief, myself included. Furthermore, even very innocent people pull deceptions for various reasons. In Spy the Lie, 3 former CIA officials revealed the methodology they developed for detecting when someone is lying to you. And now, you and I can learn their same methods for use in our daily lives. Literally everyone lies. The author's research has found that even sincere people lie at least 10 times daily. This does not mean that they are bad people. Many of these lies are relatively innocent, like when you say you follow the traffic laws, but you take rolling stops at a stop sign, or you drive just 5 miles per hour over the speed limit. Humans have a natural bias that lying is wrong, so most assume that others aren't lying, at least knowingly by default. However, to use the CIA's deception detection methods, we have to accept that deceit and honesty are equally viable possibilities at any time. This is a prerequisite to using their methods to make a strong assessment one way or the other. Today, I'd like to share most of the verbal and nonverbal deceit indicators taught in Spy the Lie and some of the mindsets and techniques to use them. Mindsets. Global behavior assessment. One of the most intuitive techniques for lie detection is what the authors call global behavior assessment. This is when you deliberately open your scope of observation to everything so you can receive the most data on your target to make an accurate determination. This makes intuitive sense, but actually plays out to be a terrible idea. You are essentially trying to drink water from a fire hose, meaning you won't be able to process everything you see consistently. So instead, we deliberately ignore any honest or positive behavior and exclusively focus on how much negative or deceptive behavior we observe. Use logic. Everything taught in this book makes logical sense, but sometimes it requires an algebra 1 or 2 level of thinking instead of an arithmetic level of thinking. Also, sometimes using logic to test if someone is deceiving you doesn't work because humans are not stiffly logical creatures. For one, if you already know something is true or not and the person in question says otherwise, yeah, it's logical to think that they're deceiving you. But humans will also be illogical. The authors cite an interesting example where a nanny stole money from her employer, and it was cash, which means there's absolutely no evidence that you could use to prove the nanny stole the money. But all it took was her employer asking her if she'd stole the money and pressing a little bit to get her to confess and then return the cash. Lack of judgment and finding the truth. As you learn the methods in this video, or from the books themselves, which are linked down below, remember that you need to speak in a neutral, kind, and absolutely non-judgmental way. For example, you can be angry or upset, even once you're pretty sure the person is lying. Furthermore, you aren't trying to prove that the person is lying, you're trying to uncover the truth, which may mean that the person or people that you're engaging with are entirely innocent. Lie detection concept, timing and clusters. Any stimulus for potentially deceptive behavior, usually a question, will be divorced from the dishonest conduct by no more than 5 seconds. This is based on polygraph chart analysis looking at respiratory, cardiovascular, and skin changes when someone is prompted to lie deliberately. Essentially, the brain can move on to thinking of something else after more than 5 seconds, so you can't reliably tie deceptive indications to your stimulus if they take place 6 or more seconds apart from the stimulus. However, just because the behavior needs to start 5 or fewer seconds post-stimulus does not mean that it cannot continue past the 5-second mark. Think of politicians who blatantly lie, but they take 2 minutes to avoid answering a simple yes or no question. You will be looking for both audio and visual signs of deception. The catch is that the average human brain runs primarily on either audio or visual cues at one time. So you must deliberately tell yourself to absorb both audio and visual information when you provide a stimulus to the subject. The author calls this L-squared mode. Unfortunately, your brain is not naturally inclined to do this, so after some time, say 30 seconds, 2 minutes, it will simply revert back to being audio primary or visual primary. So, whenever you deliver a stimulus to the subject, you must also provide a message to yourself to enter L-squared mode. During this time of 5 seconds or less from the stimulus, you will look for clusters of deceitful behavior. A cluster is any combination of 2 or more deceitful behaviors as a response to a single instance of stimulus. So they could be 1 verbal and 1 nonverbal, it could be 3 verbals, and it could be 2 nonverbals. If you see only one deceit indicator due to your stimulus, ignore it. Humans are complex creatures and can exhibit the same behavior for various reasons. For example, I could shift in my seat because the seat is uncomfortable, not because your question made me feel uncomfortable. Furthermore, being uncomfortable does not necessarily mean that I am lying. Therefore, we only consider deceitful indicators when they cluster together. The more indicators you get in response to a single stimulus, the more likely it is that the person is being deceptive or otherwise not jazzed about your stimulus. To form a cluster, a stream of deceit indicators must start inside the first 5 seconds. However, additional deceit behaviors can continue past the 5-second mark and still contribute to the same cluster. For example, if you ask a question as your stimulus, and you see the other person make a deceitful gesture around the 4-second mark, then give 2 verbal indicators over the course of a 10-second response, you now have a cluster of 3 deceitful behaviors derived from that stimulus. Now that you've observed a cluster, you do not know if the person is lying. Instead, depending on the number of indicators, you think that it is likely that your question or the topic needs more development. For example, maybe I didn't lie, but I'm still not over my father's death, or I said something awful to him the last time I saw him. Both would lead to discomfort on the topic without any deception, even if I'm one of the prime suspects in his murder case. Verbal Deception Indicator 1. Convince versus convey. This is when the target does not directly respond to your question or stimulus, and instead tries to prove that they are different from the kind of person who would do the implied bad thing. They are convincing you to trust them instead of conveying a response. For example, if you ask me if I stole the money, I might say, I go to church every Sunday. I'm telling the truth, but I'm being deceptive. This means you must be aware of this exact verbal deception indicator and the concept that you should deliberately overlook truthful behavior. Therefore, you are making your analysis primarily based on the number of negative indicators observed. Verbal Deception Indicator 2. Hidden Response. This is when someone gives a very long-winded response. Typically, the goal is to confuse the person they are responding to, but they may also be hyping themselves up for either a confession or an outright lie. So if I ramble for 2 minutes but do respond at some point during the ramble, that is an example of a hidden response. Verbal Deception Indicator 3. Refusal to answer. I don't know if I can say. Someone else could give you a better answer. This is not intrinsically deceit, hence the need for clustering, but this is someone probably dodging your question, which is suspicious. Verbal Deception Indicator 4. Repeating the question. Most people perceive extended silence before responding to a prompt as a sign of deceit. However, if the person repeats the question back to you, there's a chance that this is them buying time just the same. Since your mind operates about 10 times faster than your mouth, taking 2 or 3 seconds to repeat the question back to you may effectively give the speaker 20 to 30 seconds of thought process, a thought process that they may hope to use to deceive you. However, they also may not have heard or understood you well. So again, the cluster rule is essential. Verbal deception indicator 5. Delaying response. I knew you were going to ask me that. If the person opens with an irrelevant statement before answering, it is more likely that their response is intended to deceive. Verbal deception indicator 6. Changing details of the story without explanation. This might be when a witness states that the murderer shot the victim and then throughout the interaction can be found stating or implying that the murderer used their left hand, only to say later that their right hand was used. This could be because they aren't entirely sure, or specific details hadn't crossed their mind in an earlier response. Verbal deception indicator 7. Going on the offensive. How long have you been doing this? Might come from an adult who seeks to reduce your credibility or faith in yourself. A child might also say, "Why don't you trust me, Dad?" Being defensive is a natural human response, so while you'll see more of it from liars, the accused might also just be frustrated. Verbal deception indicator 8. Inappropriate questions. Responding to a question with a question is not a deception indicator if the question is related to yours but not repeating the question back to you. For example, if police are questioning you and ask if there are any reasons that your fingerprints would be on the laptop, it would be very reasonable to ask whose laptop it was or where it was found. If it's your spouse's computer, you've probably touched it. If it's your neighbor's laptop, that might be more suspicious. However, asking off-the-wall or unrelated questions is a deceptive indicator. If you asked, "How much did it cost?" then you may be being deceptive. In the laptop example, that's not relevant for you to explain whether or not it might have your fingerprints on it. Instead, you may be trying to determine if you're facing a misdemeanor or a felony. Verbal deception indicator 9. Overly specific. This can manifest in different ways. The interpretation of a question being too technical or narrow, or providing excess information. If a CEO is asked how his sales are doing, he might tell you that his domestic sales are up. But what if the domestic sales are only 10% of his average sales, and 90% of his business is international? Similarly, if asked if he carried on a 12-year affair, a man might say no, because it was only 11 and a half years. Haha, gotcha. This is being narrow or technical, but some questions may need a highly technical response, which may come alongside the target repeating the question back to you in their own words to ensure clarity. So, say it again. Cluster rule. At work, you might ask people what they do at work. Most honest people will be reasonably direct and give a duty title or a one-line description. A person who is more inclined to be dishonest is more likely to go in-depth on what they do. If the person thinks you won't understand a short answer, though, they might still explain more, or they could feel a relatively innocent need to impress you. So again, the cluster rule is very important. Verbal deception indicator 10. Significant change in politeness. If we like someone, we are more inclined to believe them. This means we might butter them up deliberately when trying to deceive someone. If a person is suddenly much more polite, like if they start saying sir or ma'am when you broach a particular topic, or if they start complimenting you when doing so hasn't been normal in your relationship or during that interaction, then this should be taken as a deception indicator and added to your cluster for that stimulus. Verbal deception indicator 11. Minimize the topic. If the truth of a matter puts the target at a disadvantage, they may try to lessen that sense of weakness by diminishing the topic. This could mean saying that it's not a big deal, questioning the validity of the investigation process, or making jokes when it is very inappropriate. Verbal deception indicator 12. Modify the specificity of the question. A target may ask you to rephrase the question, guiding you into a particular choice of words that they want you to have meant in the first place. This might mean the target wants to swap between things like, "Did you steal the money?" versus, "Did you rob me?" What do you mean by rob? If I deserved the cash more than you, I didn't really rob you. Robin Hood is a hero after all. Verbal Deception Indicator 13. Referral statements. Repetition is a psychological tool that makes people more likely to believe something. This is why there are marketing strategies that track how many exposures a potential customer needs to be converted into a sale. That same principle is how people become more confident of a political view if they live in a far right or far left echo chamber. If you're being entirely honest, it's easy to re-answer the question. But if you're lying and don't want to get caught in your story changing, you might say, "I already answered this," or "Wasn't my response recorded in the previous interview?" That said, people will also find it frustrating if you ask them to repeat themselves in short order. Verbal Deception Indicator 14. Invoking religion. "I swear to God," or "with my hand on a Bible." This could also be done in a lesser sense, something like "on my mother's grave," or something like that. This can be an effort to dress up a lie. Verbal Deception Indicator 15. Selective memory. "I don't remember" is a very difficult statement to refute. You would basically need mind-reading powers. This can also manifest as "to the best of my knowledge," or "as far as I know." If a CEO of a massive company is asked if anyone in his company committed fraud in the past year, he honestly doesn't know for sure. He cannot possibly track all 25,000 employees himself. I want to add that this example question is very unfair. In this case, a resolute no from the CEO would be suspicious. Verbal Deception Indicator 16. Qualifiers. Exclusion qualifiers. Responses like "basically" or "for the most part" may be used when the target wants to respond honestly, but withhold or conveniently overlook some information. Perception qualifiers. Responses like "frankly" or "to be honest" are instead used in deceit when the target is trying to make themselves look more reliable. Qualifiers are common enough in the English language that you should not count each use of a qualifier as an indicator of deception. Instead, the general use of qualifiers as a response to a stimulus is merely one indicator by itself. Verbal Deception Indicator 17. Convincing statements. This is when a longer response is used to convince you to trust the person, often avoiding any actual answer to the question. For example, in response to "do you beat your wife?" someone might say, "That's terrible. Only a monster would beat their wife. I'm no monster." They said no, but the roundabout path to get there with additional emotion layered on top of it is a deception indicator. This type of statement seems like an obviously deceitful tactic, but they are called convincing statements for a reason. In the moment, most people will fall for it. Hence, the need to prompt yourself to enter L-squared mode deliberately. That said, the man could just be legitimately offended that you think he's the one who beat his wife to death. That's a pretty normal thing to get upset about. Convincing statements take more time to speak than qualifiers, so we count each one as its own indicator. Body language or nonverbal indicators can be more powerful than their verbal counterparts in detecting deception. This is because humans might have a reflexive verbal response, but we also consciously choose to speak and what to say. Very few people are actively aware of their own body language to manipulate it, especially if they are preoccupied with trying to lie to you verbally. The authors give a brilliant example that I won't spoil here, where a CEO, who is 2 standard deviations smarter than average, probably, ends up sitting in the fetal position when he was cornered into telling a blatant lie. If a high-performing businessman is susceptible to tattle on himself via his nonverbals, chances are that any target that interests you would make similar mistakes when deceiving you. We'll discuss fewer nonverbals than we did verbals, but that's because a greater number of behaviors can fall into a single nonverbal category. Most of the good communication you get will still be nonverbal. Verbal Deception Indicator 18. Nonverbal Deception Indicator 1. Delayed Response. That's right, this one applies to both verbals and nonverbals. How long of a delay is suspicious? Well, that depends on the context and the individual. For context, consider if I asked you what you had for breakfast yesterday. You'd probably need to think for a moment before giving me an answer. It's not something you naturally commit to memory, but you can probably summon that information with some effort. In the case of nonverbals, if the person changes their posture or balance, but on a several second time delay, take this as a delayed response just like you would verbally. Nonverbal Deception Indicator 2. See or speak no evil. This is hiding your eyes or covering your mouth when responding to the other person. This might mean touching your lips as you respond or putting your hand over your eyes to rub your temples. A slow blink generally shouldn't count, but if the other person closes their eyes and keeps their eyes shut for a prolonged period when the question shouldn't require them thinking and reflecting, this should be taken as a nonverbal deception indicator and be added to your cluster. Nonverbal Deception Indicator 3. Throat Activity. If the target swallows or clears their throat before responding, this may go toward your cluster of deceptive behaviors. Of course, this is assuming that the target isn't sick. If nothing else would compel this throat activity, then being deceptive could be causing anxiety, which generates additional dryness in the throat and mouth. Nonverbal Deception Indicator 4. Fidgets and face touching. Like blocking the nose or mouth, anxiety, or the detection of a threat, can cause the body to reprioritize where blood should go. This can lead to sensations in the ears, lips, or nose, which might compel the target to touch themselves in this area. Biting their lip, licking their lips, rubbing or pulling on their ear, or scratching their nose are all viable demonstrations of this indicator. Off the face, the accused may also fiddle with their hands similarly. Each instance should not be taken as a standalone indicator. Instead, this behavior should count as one indicator towards a cluster. Nonverbal Deception Indicator 5. Anchor point movements. This is when the target changes points of contact that affect their weight or balance. This could be your legs when you stand and your arms being crossed. A change or re-anchoring would be putting your hands in your pockets and shifting your weight to be primarily on one leg instead of both. When seated, this could mean having one foot on top of the opposite leg's knee, one foot on the ground, and then both hands on armrests while leaning back in the chair. A shift could then include leaning to one side so that only one armrest is touched while placing both feet on the ground. To make it easier to pick up on these movements, you might deliberately have your target sit in a chair that can spin, rock, and roll around. Anchor point movements, again, only count as one indicator in response to one stimulus, even if multiple re-anchorings are observed. Nonverbal Deception Indicator 6. Grooming gestures. This could mean grooming yourself or your environment. It could be adjusting your tie or shirt cuffs, fiddling with your hair, moving objects on the desk unnecessarily, or adjusting your belt. Again, remember that just because a stimulus makes the subject uncomfortable does not necessarily mean that they are lying to you. So, if you've got a cluster out of a stimulus, or maybe several clusters by repeating the same stimulus or similar stimulus, what next? Well, you'll need to read the book or subscribe. I'll probably be doing more spy stuff material this year, but in the meantime, check the link in the description for some online flashcards to help you commit these indicators to memory, as well as a link to a hard copy of the book. You only have one life to live. Grow it relentlessly.